Okay, so we brought in a few sheets of drywall here. We're gonna go ahead and start tackling the ceiling. Whenever you have a new drywall project, you always want to try to do the ceilings first. And the major reason for that is if you put your ceiling drywall on first and put it all the way to the edge of the wall, essentially you can take your wall panels and push it all the way up, and that will help support that top corner there. If you were to put the walls up first and then just had the ceiling butt up into it, basically you're just relying on the screws, and over time, as the house shifts or shears with wind, you're gonna have a cracked joint. Your corner joint will be cracked all the way along the top. So it's a good idea to try to get your ceiling on first and then have your walls butt up to the bottom of the ceiling. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is cut our sheet to length, and then we're gonna go ahead and take some measurements for our light box here. The reason why we can't just go ahead and use our 8-foot length is because we need to end right on a stud to be able to protect and strengthen our butt joint here. So we're gonna have a 4x8 sheet, or just a little bit less than a 4x8 sheet, come into here, land on a stud. And then we're gonna have another sheet coming in, landing on the same stud here, our ceiling joist. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna find our ceiling joist here. And when there's plastic on the ceiling, I like to just make a little mark to know where the center is. Because again, we're gonna have half of this sheet sitting on it and then half of the next. So I'm gonna take a measurement here. Make sure your tape measure is straight. And it looks like I have 93 7/8. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut that sheet to that length. We're gonna use our full 4-foot width. And then once we get that sheet cut to length, we'll be able to take some measurements for our light box. Okay, so we have our sheet of drywall here. Again, we're using 5/8 for the ceiling. And I'm gonna go ahead and take that 93 7/8 measurement and cut this sheet to length. So one important thing to kind of note here, we're not gonna just pick a random side and cut off a little chunk to make this 93 7/8. We want to make sure that we are intentional of keeping this side here perfectly straight. We have a factory edge, so when we have our remaining sheet on the ceiling butting up into it, we want to make sure that we have factory edge meeting factory edge. So we have the white paper side facing us, because that's the side that's going to be facing down on the ceiling. The brown side goes up towards the insulation side. So if we kind of think about it here, if we hooked on our tape measure here and came over here to 93 7/8 and made a mark, we'd be cutting off our good side here. So even though we took our measurement from that wall in the house, we want to reverse our tape measure here, take the measurement from our good side, and then we'll come over here to 93 7/8 and make a little mark. So now, what we can do is we have a drywall square here. This can slide back and forth across the top of the sheet here, and then you know you have a square cut. So when cutting drywall, all you need to do is make a pretty light score, and then you can just bend it and it'll snap. So we can move our square here to our mark, and then I usually like to hold it with my foot on the bottom a little bit, and then we can just run our knife right along this square. All right, and then we can put our square down, and we can just bend this drywall. Sometimes you need to make a little bit bigger score on this 5/8 stuff. The 1/2 inch stuff breaks pretty easy. And just run your knife down. So once you score it just a little bit deeper, you can just kind of tap it here, and it breaks right along that edge. Then you can just come up along the back and trim off the back of the paper here. Okay. Okay, so we got that edge cut off. A lot of times when you cut an edge of drywall, it doesn't snap perfect. A lot of times there's these little 1/8 inch little bumps here. So if you have a drywall rasp handy, it's nice to be able to just clean up that edge. That way when you go ahead and put it up to that top plate of that wall, it'll sit nice and tight up to the wall. So we got our sheet cut. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and take some measurements for our light box up there and transfer them to our sheet and go ahead and cut it. So let's go get our measurements. So what we're gonna go ahead and try to do here is we're gonna take a few measurements because we have a light box here. Again, if you remember, we have that light box sticking out 5/8 of an inch, so it's flush with the front of the drywall. So we have to cut the drywall around that. And this is a time where you want to be really, really accurate because if you kind of think towards the finishing stages, we're going to have a light up here, and a lot of times there's just a metal cover that's on the light that just goes right up there and covers the remaining hole. So you don't want to make that hole too big to make sure that that cover completely fits any holes that are up there. So what we're going to basically try to do is keep our measurement about 1/8 inch bigger than the diameter of this light switch here, light box here. So what I'm going to do is I know I'm going to put my corner of my drywall to this wall here, and it's going to go to this wall. So I'm basically going to cover this first 4x8 corner of this wall. I'm going to land on a stud. I'm going to take a measurement here, but to get started I want to reference off of this wall and reference off of this wall because I'm going to place the sheet into that corner. So I'm going to go ahead and take a measurement here, and to the front of the box I got 42 7/8, and to the back of the box I got 46 3/8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract just a little bit more than 1/16 of an inch from the front and add on just a little bit more than 1/16 to the back. That way it creates that 1/8 inch gap, or just a little bit bigger than an 1/8 inch gap in the front and back. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and switch positions here. And again, I'm measuring from this wall because we're putting the sheet towards that wall. I'm not going to measure here because I won't have anything to measure off of on the sheet. So we'll change positions here. And I'll go ahead and measure to the front. I got 65 5/8, and to the back I got 69 1/8. Again, I'll subtract that 1/16 from the front and add it to the back to give me extra diameter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and transfer those marks to my drywall. Okay, so we got our measurements from the inside there, and I went ahead and wrote them out on my block of wood here just so I can have a reference. Remembering I subtracted 1/16 from the front and added it to the back to give us that 1/8 inch clearance all the way around the box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just picture this sheet up on the ceiling. and kind of remember where I took my measurements from. So I measured from that wall. This is our wall side here. So I'm gonna go ahead and hook my tape onto it. And it looks like our first measurement was 65 9/16. So I'm gonna come back here. 65 9/16. And then on the other side was 69 3/16. Okay. And then again, picturing this sheet on the ceiling, I know that this edge is my far wall. That's the same spot I took my measurements from. So looks like our first measurement was 42 3/4. Okay, and then 46 3/16. All right, so I have a few marks on here now, and what I'm actually gonna do is grab my drywall square here again, and I'm just gonna make a square, basically. Need to go a little higher. All right, so just gonna draw a plumb line down on my vertical lines here. And then I'm gonna switch my square to the side, run it up, do my top and bottom. So I've just connected all my lines here, and I've practically just made a square. And if you remember, our light box is a circle. So what you can do is you can just connect your diagonals here to find your exact center of this square. So I'll go from corner to corner. And then if you actually have a compass on site, you can go ahead and put the point of the compass in the center and then line it up with the edge and make your circle. A lot of times you don't have a compass, but a really cool trick is if you have the rest of your drywall, the edge of your drywall has all this paper, and you can make a really cheap and quick compass by poking a screw through it here. And you would use that screw as your point of your compass. And then you line up where you want your pencil mark to be. Make a little mark. And you make a hole right where that mark is. Put your screw back right where it started in that original mark. And then you can use that paper as a cheap compass. And you have a pretty good circle. So those lines that you measured are a pretty good reference. And as long as it's within just a hair of the line, you can see I got maybe about an 1/8 inch there. That's gonna be good enough. You want some play because when you have a few volunteers holding up this sheet, you wanna be able to move that sheet around and get it screwed up quickly so they're not holding it forever. So that's why I try to keep the measurements to a 1/16. When you actually use a keyhole saw to cut this out, you're not gonna stay on the line perfectly anyway. If you add too much to your measurement, let's say you added an 1/8 or 3/16, once you start doing a circle like this and cutting out with a keyhole saw, then you're just gonna be way too big. So keep your measurements, your additions to about a 1/16 of an inch, and then the discrepancies with the saw and making a circle, you'll come out pretty perfect every time. So to cut out this circle, we're gonna use what's called a keyhole saw or a drywall saw. It's just a piece of steel with some pretty thick kerfs and teeth here, and it goes through drywall pretty easily. So basically it has a sharp point here, and all you have to do is poke it through the drywall and then follow your line. All right, so we went ahead and finished cutting our hole for our electrical box here, and we're gonna go ahead and put this sheet in place. But before we throw this sheet up there, it's a good idea. Basically, when you throw this sheet of drywall up on the ceiling, you're not gonna be able to see where your ceiling joists hit the wall. So what I like to do is I like to take a Sharpie and then just come along here, feel where your ceiling joist is, and make a mark right in the center of it. That way you know right where your ceiling joist is when that sheet of drywall is up. So just go along here and mark out all these ceiling joists. All right, so it's a good idea when handling sheets to have a few people ready to help. When working with volunteers, it works really well to have 2 holders, especially with 8-foot sheets. You can have one person, their primary role is to just stand on one side and hold the sheet up and move it back and forth. Then you'll have one person with a screw gun, maybe 2, ready to start screwing off the sheet. And then maybe it's a good idea to, if you have enough volunteers, to have a spotter to kind of make sure that the sheet's one, tight up against the corner and the front wall, and also that it's ending right on the center of a ceiling joist. So we have one volunteer here today that's just going to help hold this sheet up, and we'll go ahead and get it screwed into place. So if you want to hold this edge of the drywall, we'll go ahead and tilt it back. Okay. There's a little ladder there for you to use. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and just push it straight up to the ceiling. And then I wanna make sure that our box fits, which our measurements were pretty good. Looks like we're sitting well there. We're tight up against the wall and we're tight up against the corner. So we can go ahead and throw a few screws in here. Now the initial idea, I'm not really worrying about where I put these screws. I just want to get this sheet up so it'll stay in place. So 3 is good enough on this side. And then I'll come around here and get a few sheets in. Or a few screws in, I should say. Okay, that'll be good. You can hop down real quick. Oops. All right, so to just get started, I have a few screws in. And before you get carried away with putting too many screws in, you can just make sure that you have the sheet right exactly where you want it. If you noticed, when putting these screws in too, I didn't drive them really tight to or into the drywall. I left it so the head is just going or just under the surface of the drywall. If I'm gonna go ahead and do an example of what you shouldn't do here. If you have a screw and you're driving it in, right now I'm just under the surface of the paper. If you go too far in, I broke that surface of the paper, and now I'm just basically holding on that gypsum material inside, and that screw's really not doing anything. So whenever doing these screws, you want to just go under the surface of the paper and don't break the paper. Okay, so if you've noticed, we just have the sheet up, but we have a little issue here in the corner. We're actually not pushed all the way up. So what you want to do is, before you start getting too many screws in, make sure that your sheet is all the way pressed up and you have good contact with the ceiling. So I'm going to move the ladder here just a little bit. Okay. You want to make sure that the sheet's all the way up. All right. Get a few screws in here. All right, so to make things easier whenever putting in the rest of the screws here, it's kind of difficult when you don't have a line on the drywall itself. So what we can do is we have a level here, and this is a really good thing for volunteers to be able to do. You can go ahead and take a pencil and take your level. Line it up with the center of the ceiling joist and line it up with that line you made on the wall. And now you can just make a line across, and you know that the center of that ceiling joist is right on this line. So now you can go ahead and screw off this sheet, making sure that you hit, or knowing that you're going to hit the ceiling joist there. You can do that on every ceiling joist. That way, again, you have that reference line. So a little bit about putting screws in the ceiling here. You can see, again, just to start, I just got enough screws in there to keep the sheet up. I didn't really worry about pattern. But what you do want to try to do is get basically 5 screws in every ceiling joist. And we're actually going to do 10, but I'm going to explain what I mean by 5. So I got my first one here, just under the surface. If you notice, I came in about an inch or 2 from the edge. You don't want to get your screws right up to the edge of this drywall because there's not much strength on the edge of these pieces. You want to come in. If you went towards the edge, basically that would break out and snap on you. Then I also got another one on this edge. Same thing, came in about 2 inches. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to split that distance and put one right in the middle. Just under the surface. Then I'm going to split that distance again. And then split this last one here again. All right, so this ceiling joist now has 5 screws. They're equally spaced. And you want to try to get them equally spaced. If you put like 3 over here and then 2 really close over here, you have a space that isn't supported with any screws. So that's why I just go ahead and keep breaking or splitting that distance in half. That way you have them exactly in the middle. So now that we have the 5 up there, if this was a wall panel, we'd be done. But for a ceiling, I like to do a little bit added strength here, and within an inch or inch and a half of each screw, I'm going to go ahead and put a second screw. And the reason why I do that is it's just an added insurance, if you will. If one of these screws happens to break the paper, again, losing its strength, that second screw will definitely hold it. Oop. All right, so this ceiling joist is done. We can go ahead and do the other ones on this sheet. We can get right up against the wall here. But one thing I do want to point out is I'm not going to put any screws along this last seam here. The seam where the basically the factory edge lands on a ceiling joist, I don't want to put any screws on that edge yet. Basically, if I put a screw on there, it's going to break out that edge, and I won't be able to put another factory edge up to it nice and tight. That's going to help you whenever you whenever you're at the taping and mudding stage. If you have a nice tight seam there, it'll just finish a lot better with the tape and mud. So no screws along that last edge. We'll go ahead and finish screwing off this sheet, and we'll get some measurements for our next sheet. All right, so we got our first sheet in place, and now we can go ahead and continue this run here. So what we're gonna do, luckily we have no obstructions in our way, so all we have to do is take a quick measurement and cut this sheet to length. So we'll go ahead and take a measurement from our top plate here to our drywall. It looks like we got 42 3/4. It's a good idea to go ahead and measure this opposite side too, just to make sure that you're running straight. And here I got 42 7/8. So we're not running perfectly square, or maybe our ceiling just isn't perfectly square, but that's pretty darn close. So what I'm gonna do is subtract just a little bit. We don't need to be super tight to the wall, because again, our wall panel is gonna come up. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and just cut this at 42 5/8, and that'll just give us a little wiggle room on the side here. And again, that side panel will come up and support that. So 42 5/8, and we'll go ahead and transfer that measurement to one of our sheets out here. So if you remember, again, we have our factory edge there, and we want to put our cut side towards the wall. So again, the white side is facing us because that's going to be the side that's showing in the room. We have our factory edge up there, so I'm going to butt this factory edge up to it. So this is the side we're going to take our measurement from. So we had 43 5/8. Go ahead and make a mark. And then we'll take our drywall square here. And our drywall square is a little long, so I have these blocks set up. Go ahead and throw the sheet up on blocks. All right. And again, same concept here. We're just gonna make a score mark. And then we'll be able to break this sheet right along that line. So we can take it off our blocks here. And what I like to do is just go ahead and stand right behind it, and you can just kind of knee right where you made that score mark, and it'll snap. So, all right, now that it's snapped, you can just come along the back side here and just cut right through the paper. And then you'll have your sheet ready. All right, so just like our first cut here, I'll take a drywall rasp and just clean up our edge so it fits tight to the wall. All right. So we can bring it inside here. We'll go ahead and move our ladders in place. All right. And then we'll go ahead and put this piece up into place. So you can get your volunteer here. They can grab one side. You want to go up the ladder first. There you go. Okay. Bring our factory edge up first. Okay. And then we'll push it up against the wall. Okay, so before we kind of screw anything in place, we want to make sure that our back edge here is nice and straight with our back edge of the previous sheet. That way we're running nice and straight, making a nice line. And then we want to make sure that our butt seam here is nice and tight. So how are we looking over in that corner? We got something holding up there?
Yeah, it's not going all the way up.
Okay. So let's go ahead and take this down real quick. See if there's anything behind there. Is there anything behind that holding this up?
Just the plastic.
Okay. Yep.
Just the joist. I don't know.
So this is a pretty common thing that happens. Every once in a while, the plastic will get a little too tight in a corner right here. So basically, we can't get the sheet nice and tight. So what you can do is you can actually just make a little slit here. Kind of relieve that pressure. And then we'll come back with some seam tape here and cover that hole up. That way we can get that sheet nice and tight to the wall. So we'll go grab some seam tape real quick and patch this hole. All right, so we went ahead and fixed that plastic in the corner there.
All right, my side's butted.
There you go.
There we go.
All right.
Nice.
So now we fit pretty good here. So again, we're gonna make sure that our seam is nice and tight and that our edge over here is nice and flush. If this edge isn't flush and we try to put our next sheet on, we're basically gonna kind of cockeye our next sheet a little bit and we won't be running straight for the rest of the project. So it's real important to make sure this seam is nice and tight and that we're flush on that seam right there. And then we can go ahead and throw some screws in. All right, so we got this sheet up just in place. We'll go ahead and draw our lines with a level, and then we'll be able to take care of our seam right here. Okay, so we went ahead and got our sheets up in place, and there's just a few things I want to quickly comment on before we before we move on to the walls. So again, we have our light box here, and we have just a little gap around the box itself, so that plate covers it. But then I also want to talk about our seams here. If you notice, whenever you get a full sheet of drywall, on the long edges, there's a taper on it. Whenever we are putting drywall on the ceilings or the wall itself, we want to make sure that we have those tapers meeting each other. And the reason for that, you'll see it here in a little bit when we start taping and mudding, but it basically makes a little cove on this seam here. That way, basically we can embed that tape underneath the surface of the drywall, and it just makes it a lot easier to finish this seam. Again, that'll make a little bit more sense when we get to taping and mudding, but you just want to make sure that you get your tapered seams meeting up. Then again, we briefly talked about our butt seams here, and we have two seams that are matching up, where we're going to have to do a little bit different method of taping and mudding here. But basically, what we really want to focus on is we have a very tight seam here. So if we look at this corner, these two sheets meet up nice and tight. And then if we look at this corner, these two sheets meet up nice and tight. And basically, if one side met up tight and the other side had like a 1/4 inch gap, basically that means your two sheets aren't lining up straight. And what's going to happen is you're basically making an arc on your ceiling with your sheets. So we have a relatively small room here, but let's say we are doing a larger room like 60 by 40, and we started out with a 1/4 inch gap here. By the time we get to the other side of the ceiling on the opposite wall, we could have an inch gap there, and we won't even be landing on our studs, basically because you're making that arc, and as you get further away from that arc, you're going to have a bigger gap. So it's really important, especially on your first row, to get these all nice and tight. And again, we got this edge nice and tight. Same concept. If we were offset here, we would have created an 1/8 inch gap or something here. And that's just gonna magnify as you go across the ceiling. So the more time you take getting your first row nice and straight, the rest of your sheets you can just butt right up into it. And it's just gonna go a lot smoother and quicker. Another thing I wanted to kind of point out here, if you notice, I have a butt seam here, and then instead of cutting this row in the same manner, basically having a large sheet over on this side and a short piece over on this side, we would have one long butt seam here. We want to avoid that. We want to stagger our seams. That way, if any movement in the house were to happen, especially with just like the house settling or wind coming along and blowing the walls, basically, if we have one seam here and then this next sheet breaks up that seam, it's going to make this seam a lot stronger, and you won't have as much cracking along your mud or your taping and mudding. If you had one long seam going all the way across, that basically just opens up the ceiling to be able to move a little bit more, and then you'll have a crack going all the way across your ceiling along that seam. So stagger your seams and it'll create a better finish. So if you remember, I kind of hinted that it's a lot easier to not screw or put any screws in your butt joints until all your sheets are up. And again, the reason for that is if you were to screw this edge, it would break out some of the gypsum, and it would be hard to get the next sheet in. And if you have two factory edges meeting up, you know you're going to be nice and straight with no gaps in there. So now that they're next to each other, we can go ahead and start screwing off on this edge. And it's going to be just like the rest of the screws. You want it to just be under the surface. And you want two screws basically right next to each other. All right, So now that we brought those screws nice and flush, our butt seam here is nice and flush, it's gonna make it a lot easier to tape and mud later. So we're gonna go every 6 inches along this seam. And because we're screwing so close to each other, we don't have to do that double screw like we did on the rest of the ceiling joists. So every 6 inches along this seam, and that'll pull the seam together nice and tight. So we'll go ahead and finish screwing off this seam. We got one more butt joint right there, and then we'll go ahead and finish drawing all of our lines for our ceiling joists and screwing off the rest of the ceiling joist with that 5 pattern. Again, we're using 10 screws, but basically spacing out 5 different sections of screws. So we'll go ahead and get all that laid out and we'll get this ceiling screwed off.